On March 22nd this year, I had an episode about Angus Fletcher. I want to come back to Angus Fletcher. I actually came across Angus again through the Hugh Henry podcast. And just a little shout out here. I think Hugh Henry started his podcast about maybe a year and a half ago. He inspired me to do this podcast. And I thought he's always been an incredibly interesting person to me. But he was kind of on the sort of declining arch of inspiration, getting old, sitting out there in a Caribbean island and all that. But, I underestimate Hugh. He's incredibly interesting. He's getting more interesting. I feel like he's going through a process. He's bringing on interesting people on his podcast. That's the only connection I have with him. I don't have any other connection. And I just shout out here, I think you should never underestimate people, particularly people that have a history of being interesting in the past. That gene seems to be working. But let's get back to Angus Fletcher. This episode is about Angus Fletcher. So what is going on here? Angus Fletcher is a scholar in literature, and he is using literature as a tool, as a technology to form our brains, to create things like empathy and courage, to help leaders lead. So he is taking literature out of this sort of oblivious, convoluted space of academics where nobody really knows what it's good for, and he's using it more like a STEM thing, like, hey, this is actually a technology we can use to get stuff done. I find that very encouraging. Again, on March 22nd this year, I had an episode about this. What I want to talk about today is a statement he made on a video I saw. Actually, he didn't talk about this on the, oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. He did talk about this on the Hugh Henry podcast, which just came out. So he spoke about this concept that literature is actually not about the author. Literature is about the audience. So the audience grabs all these hundreds of thousands, millions of authors every moment, and then decides what is really interesting. And in order to, let's say as a person, if you write, the best way to try to be, try to become one of those authors that the audience picks is to be different, to be unique. And this is also in line with, I think, what neuroscience would tell us about the brain. The brain is constantly processing ideas, and then the best ideas sort of win in sort of a Darwinian type of competition. Where Fletcher loses me is in the idea of AI not being able to write books. I want to talk about this also, but I want to really focus on this idea that stories are really what drives. We humans are driven by stories. We're not machines. We have a massive computation power in the brain that helps us as a tool to get stuff done. We're very reasonable people in a sense. We use reason, but it's not the whole story. And I want to talk about iteration also, and what creativity means for me and what it means for Fletcher. But most importantly, I think given the idea that we tell stories and then the stories get evaluated in the marketplace, that's what we call audience, and then reflected as successful or not, this is really the key for writers, this is the key for hedge fund managers, for entrepreneurs, anybody else who has an ambition to compete in the marketplace for ideas is exposed to this market. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's December 17th, 2021. This is Krim Delco for the day. The fund is up 2.55%. The market's down 1.05%. For the year, we're up 20.9%. The market is up 21.35%. We're underperforming by 0.45%. So let's talk about Angus Fletcher again. I refer listeners to my episode on March 22nd, where I talk about the technology aspect of literature. And I just want to reiterate very quickly, instead of analyzing words, instead of analyzing techniques in narratives and things like that that typical academics do, Fletcher is taking this whole thing sort of upside down and saying literature is part of STEM in a sense that it gets stuff done. The same way that physics helps us build the old Golden Gate Bridge, literature helps us build Tesla. Literature helps us build Apple. Literature helps us win wars. This is a real important part of humanity, and we shouldn't pervert it into this academic science that has no purpose. The purpose of literature is to create empathy and courage, which are very strong tools for people to get stuff done. That's my interpretation. This is not what Fletcher said verbally. I haven't had the chance to talk to him. I did request an interview. Maybe I can talk to him, maybe not. But what I think the key here is let's narrow it down. What is literature good for? It creates courage and empathy. Now, I have spoken on this podcast many, many times, inspired by Fletcher, saying that for me as a hedge fund manager, it is crucial to read. And I was always thinking to myself, why is it so important? I know it's important, but I couldn't fathom why. And then when I came across Fletcher the first time, and I mentioned this in my first episode, I think it's conditioning. It's conditioning to the brain. It is literally like doing push-ups and pull-ups for a fighter. You're not learning techniques. You're not learning footwork for striking or jiu-jitsu techniques or takedown techniques in wrestling. But you need the conditioning to be even able to do that, to warm up your muscles and do all that stuff. Now, the statement that he made on the Hugh Henry podcast, which caught my attention, is that he said that books are really, or excuse me, authors and stories are really chosen by the audience. So yes, you write the story, of course. I don't want to diminish the work of an author. Anybody who's writing a book knows that I'm just in the process of writing my own memoirs, and it's incredibly challenging to write a book. But the ultimate decision of who is going, if this book is going to be interesting or not, is going to be the audience. It's not me. It's not the editor. Or by the way, I don't have an editor, but that's a different story. But the point here is, I don't really care about what I think, and I don't really care about what anybody else thinks other than the audience, which is the marketplace. So having said that, now let's talk a little bit about what else Fletcher is saying. Fletcher is saying that we can lead by stories. He's very adamant about the fact that narratives are really what makes us tick. We are not people that, or excuse me, we are not a species that works with logic as a tool to make us act. So we use logic as a tool. But the actual thing that makes us act, so if you want the cause and reaction, the reaction comes through stories. The stories get analyzed through logic, so we use logic. And there's one thing he says on the Hugh Henry podcast, which says we are not, or something like he doesn't believe in rational people. And Hugh Henry himself says, I don't believe in rational people. Now, I have a different view of this. I think we are very rational. People are rational in a sense that it's the only game in town. When I write a story, when I develop a thesis for my investment, when I teach my kid how to play soccer, whatever it is, I always use ration. I am rational because that's the only game in town. What will be something irrational? It's not using the tools of logic that we have developed as humans. That would be stupid. So we have rationality. The problem is it's a tool. It's not the whole story. It's not good. It's not enough. Rationality is not enough. It is there, but it's not enough. So I think I want to throw in Chiara Marletto here. I believe, this is the way I think about it, is that creativity, this is something that Fletcher talks a lot about, and innovation is all driven by error correction, by iteration. So what we have is rationality, but we have to find a way to iterate very fast, and that's what we call iteration. And this is where creativity comes out. And now I'm circling back to Fletcher because he says himself, he says that creativity is courage. And I am 100% in agreement with that because I believe creativity is driven by courage in the sense that you have to be actually willing to iterate. That takes courage because you can make mistakes, you can make errors. And I spoke about this on my March 22nd episode. One of the biggest problems I think with people, particularly with adults, is that they feel shame when they make mistakes. And that's why they don't iterate, and that's where creativity falls short. That's why children are much more creative because they don't feel shame. Shame is a big blocker of creativity. And this is one of the key problems that you find in companies. This is where the rubber meets the road for hedge fund managers. When you look for companies that generate wealth, we've said that many times here, it is about the cost of iteration. The lower the cost of iteration, the higher the error correction rate, the higher the innovation rate, the more wealth you're going to generate. The problem here is, how do you do that with a workforce that is human? Humans don't like to iterate. So this is the key. And the way you do it, and now this is, I think Fletcher would sign up for that. He would say that through stories. You can create action through telling them a story. I want to go to Mars. I want to decarbonize the Earth. I want to get us off fossil fuels. These are stories. The same way Steve Jobs was building stories. I don't know what exactly his stories were, but he was building stories the same way Bezos was telling stories. They weren't as inspirational as Musk, but it's stories. Leaders, entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs tell stories. That's how they galvanize people to iterate and make mistakes, because you don't feel ashamed by making a mistake if your goal is to go to Mars. If your goal is to build a rocket which can get many tons out in orbit, that is some sort of logical goal, and if you fail, you feel ashamed. But if your goal is to go to Mars and you fail, you're like, okay, fine, I failed, I'm going to try again. I think this is absolutely fundamental. And I find the biggest and the most interesting thing about this whole story now is that I feel that entrepreneurs are being judged by the audience. Hedge fund managers are being judged by the audience, which is the market. Authors are being judged by the audience. Anything we do as humans is always, we're trying to evolve a new species in a sense of a new idea, a new story that hopefully creates some sort of action. This is what an author does. An author is in the business of creating new stories that somehow create action. Audiences react. An investment manager is in the business of creating new ideas and investing. Hopefully the market reflects that in higher returns. An entrepreneur is in the business of creating new products and services which get reflected in sales and therefore success. So anything we do is always exposed to the marketplace. This also circles back to what is economics. It's the theory of competitive response. Everything is about competitive response. And the best way to compete is to iterate fast. Thank you.